Welcome back to the other side of the chart.
And so we did the work of medical aid in dying, but what I really want to talk about is that what he wanted was to have his suffering addressed. He had been through every kind of treatment the past year. Nothing was working. His pain was increasing. His suffering was increasing. And he just wanted to be listened to, even though he had no physical voice. So I think it's a really important example. And we were able to move ahead relatively quickly in being able to approve him for medical aid in dying. And when I saw him just a day before he took medication, I'll never forget him on the screen when I said any other questions or could I do anything else for him. He looked at me and he blew me a kiss and gave me a big thumbs up. And that, I think, is the story of what patients want. They want to be heard, and they want to have their suffering addressed.
I'm your host, Dr. Jill Goldenberg, and this podcast is all about the people behind the healthcare system, the patients, the clinicians, the policy leaders, and the innovators working to make care better, more human, and more effective. This show is for anyone who's ever felt lost in the system and for those of us trying to fix it. Today, we're exploring one of the most profound and deeply human topics in medicine, the final chapter of life. End-of-life care raises questions of autonomy, compassion, and what it really means to center care around the patient. My guest is Dr. Barbara Morris, a geriatrician and national leader in medical aid in dying. Through decades of experience caring for older adults and co-founding End of Life Options Colorado, Dr. Morris helped shape how patients, families, and clinicians navigate these deeply personal choices. In this conversation, we'll talk about palliative care, hospice, and medical aid in dying, and ultimately, what it means to honor patients' voices at the end of life. Barbara, I am so honored to have you here.
Thanks, Jill. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm honored to be called a leading person. We have a lot of great voices in this field, so I'm proud to be among their company. I'm a primary care geriatrician. I've had decades of experience caring for older adults in longitudinal settings with continuity and developed relationships. I've also served as medical director in a variety of settings, helping to shape programs and care for older adults. I really considered end-of-life care to be part of geriatrics and part of my responsibility in caring for patients across the spectrum of their illness. And when I first started doing this work, of course, we did not have medical aid in dying in Colorado, but we did have other tools that are very important. And so when the statute in Colorado was being considered, I found myself very supportive of that. I was not particularly involved in the advocacy at that time, but really I viewed medical aid in dying as an additional tool that we would have among other tools we have for patients at the end of life. I really realized after the law was passed, I think those working on it thought, oh, great, the law is passed, our work is done. And frankly, they were exhausted and they needed a break. And so our law went into effect in 2017, and we've realized over the past number of years that it wasn't adequate to just have the law. We have to have education and access. And so I left my ambulatory geriatrics practice not quite 2 years ago and have been focusing on both my consulting practice in end-of-life care and geriatric care management, as well as being one of the co-founders of End of Life Options Colorado, just to know that our mission is to increase access and education to Coloradans as regards their end-of-life options, medical aid in dying being one of those options.
Yeah. Well, gosh, thanks, Barbara. That is a fantastic intro. And I love how you kind of frame this in your career of geriatrics and how this is a tool in our toolbox. Let's start with the why. You've cared for so many patients across the aging spectrum. Can you tell the audience what patients actually want at the end of life and how often do they actually get that?
As with most things in medicine, I think what patients want and what their loved ones want is variable. And the problem is we don't always step back and take a moment to inquire as to what patients want. And I think that's where one of the first gaps is. And I'll tell you, when I think back on my work, I've been very humbled because many times as clinicians, consciously or subconsciously, we're talking about what we want or what we think we would want if we were in their shoes.
Right.
But guess what? We're not always right. In fact, more often we're wrong. So when I think about what patients really want, and what I've learned is they want to be listened to. They want to have good information.
Sure.
They don't want clinicians couching things in language that doesn't make any sense. And they want to be cared for. And this is a hard one for a lot of people working with patients with terminal illness. They want hope, but at the same time, they want reality. Now, think about that. That's a real balancing act, right?
Yeah.
They really want both things. And, I think it's very important to understand that Colorado, as in the rest of the United States, we're late to the game in helping patients with these things. They often are admitted to hospice way late in their trajectory, not getting palliative care, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. And they want their suffering to be addressed. And they want their loved ones and their advocates to be part of those decisions. So, I was thinking about this patient who I just worked with a couple of weeks ago. This was, for me, a relatively young person in his mid-60s. That's young in geriatrics.
Yeah.
He had been very healthy before, and I got a somewhat desperate call from a family saying that hospice had referred the patient for consideration for aid in dying. He had had a horrible laryngeal cancer resulting in a laryngectomy and inability, of course, to vocalize. So speaking of communication, think about that.
Yeah.
You're faced with a terminal illness, end of life, and you have to figure out a new way to communicate. So here was the good news. His family and he had come up with a method in which he could communicate with whiteboard and with his phone, kind of talking. And even though he lived too far for me to go and see him, I was able to have several conversations with him virtually with the help of his family, who were very distraught about his rapid decline, but really wanted to help him.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you for that answer and sharing that patient story. This is a good segue to talk about the difference between palliative, hospice, and medical aid in dying. I think there are a lot of people, the general public in particular, and maybe even leaders listening to this podcast, conflate these different things. So can you walk us through how they're different and actually where they overlap, and maybe even, again, some examples of where it's important to use these different tools in our toolbox?
I think it helps to think of this from the patient's point of view, right? Which is what you want to talk about, which is great.
Yeah.
So if you think about a patient, say the patient I was just talking about, who doesn't always happen this way, but he had a pretty sudden diagnosis of a pretty bad cancer. And I wasn't involved in that time, but let's just imagine you receive this diagnosis. It's overwhelming. You're having a lot of symptoms, but you're going to fight the illness. So you go to oncology, or you go to surgery, or you go to radiation therapy, and that's for the curative approach. But in the meantime, the patient's having a lot of symptoms, a lot of existential suffering about, am I dying? Am I not dying? What are my goals of care? So that's when palliative care becomes really important. So palliative care, people need to remember, is a program of care, an approach to care. It's not a place or a procedure. And palliative care, the way I think of it, is it comes up along the care team, whatever that care team is, aggressive, not aggressive, surgical, radiation therapy, and so forth. It helps the patient and the loved ones have these conversations of what are the long-term goals of care. Do I want to have surgery? What's important to me? Is it seeing the sunrise? Is it being able to hike a 14er? And palliative care clinicians are incredibly skilled at helping people parse that out.
Sure.
And if they get involved early, which in this example you would want, they stay alongside the patient so that if things don't improve, which could be, then they can help patients move towards a more comfort care approach and make some of those transitions. The other thing to remember about palliative care, which is important, well, several things. One is there are palliative care providers in multiple settings. Inpatient, ICU. Now we have palliative care folks in the emergency room sometimes, ambulatory, home-based, etc.
Yep.
And palliative care is not a program that's restricted to a terminal illness diagnosis.
Sure.
So that's really important because we have so many patients who are suffering from chronic illnesses, particularly pain syndromes, other syndromes where we don't have a terminal diagnosis with a poor prognosis, but we have a lot of suffering.
Sure.
Palliative care is not restricted to the terminality like we'll get you with hospice and aid and dying.
Yeah.
So I think that that's really, really important. I was giving a talk actually in public, not to health professionals, a few months ago, and I described this approach. And someone in the audience said, well, shouldn't everybody get that all the time in their patient care? Well, bingo, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So the answer is, well, yes, in a different society with a different structure or a different paradigm about healthcare, I think that that's true. This has evolved in not only the United States, but other countries because there was need and because these issues were not being addressed by what we think of as the traditional part of the care team.
Yeah.
So that's palliative care. You know, hospice care, some of our patients really need education information. I'll hear things like, they wanted to kill mom, they wanted to send her to hospice.
Yeah.
I'm going to hospice to die. We've all heard these phrases,
right.
And we have to bust those myths, both for ourselves and for our patients. So hospice is a program of care. Again, it's not a place. We're not going there. In rare instances, we have a place, but it's not a physical place. It's a program of care. In the United States, there are a lot of regulations about hospice. So we have to have a terminal illness with a predicted prognosis of 6 months or less in order to qualify for hospice care. And it's a carve-out. It's an all-inclusive program. So hospice pays for the medications that are related to the terminal illness, the equipment, lots of resources with volunteers, CNAs, spiritual support, some respite care. And it's really intended to move from curative treatment to comfort care, understanding that we don't always know when the end of life will come, but that this is the last part. And, you know, for many patients, it's really interesting once they get settled in hospice care, particularly at home.
Yeah.
And we get rid of all those nasty medications and we stop the visits to the emergency room. Things can calm for a while. It's not that it cures their illness, but it gives a space of time where symptoms are controlled and where patients and loved ones can continue that communication and that end-of-life planning. So it can be very powerful when patients actually seem to improve somewhat on hospice care.
Yeah.
One of the issues we have in the United States is that we tend to admit to hospice too late.
Sure.
You've heard these stories, someone in the emergency room who has a terrible diagnosis, not thought that there's any curative treatment, and they're abruptly sent home to hospice, and it's very fast. We even have that happen with people who've had their diagnosis, but for whatever reason, hospice is not being considered. And then all the support that hospice gives, all the people I mentioned before, it's pretty hard to get that all going if there's only a few days.
Yeah.
So we're much in favor of, if it's time to turn to comfort care, that people consider hospice. Back to location, also a lot of myths. Hospice is almost always now home hospice. Hospice does not provide 24/7 in-person care. And that's really important for professionals and the public to know.
Right.
Lots of services, an on-call nurse, getting medications delivered, equipment. But for patients who need a lot of physical help or need someone, the family and the loved ones have to provide some of that. Hospice can also be provided in skilled nursing facilities, nursing homes, in which case I see that as the hospice team then coming in and supplementing the care in the nursing home.
Right.
And so that can work very effectively. And then on rare occasion, if a patient's symptoms cannot be controlled in the home or nursing home setting, we have the ability for patients to go to what's called inpatient acute hospice, where we think either the plan will be to get the symptoms under control and they go back home, or it's their last days and they're going to stay in the hospice center where they will take their last breath. So I think there are a lot of complicated things about hospice, but what I would want people to remember out of this is that hospice as a program provides incredible support, both physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually for patients and their loved ones. And we should be opening that conversation with patients probably way sooner than we do.
Yeah. So where does medical aid in dying now fit in?
Yeah.
And then maybe talk about, too, this is something that we have here in Colorado. we weren't the first state. Talk to us more about that trajectory.
Medical aid in dying, in my opinion, as a once primary care geriatrician and now a consultant, is that medical aid in dying is a tool in the end-of-life toolbox, okay? So I want people to visualize that, and then I'll tell you a somewhat funny story about a patient from this week. Imagine the end-of-life toolbox, right? And it has many things in it. Hospice care, comfort care, medication, spiritual care, like I've talked about. And then over the past decades in the United States, we've been able to add medical aid in dying as an option. So, medical aid in dying, the definition that's in the state statute, I won't read to you because nobody can understand it. It's just legalese. But really, medical aid in dying is a way that patients who have the capacity can choose to hasten their death if they're suffering from a terminal illness is overwhelming and they're aware there's no other way out of the situation. So for some patients, medical aid in dying is a wonderful and compassionate tool. But I like to emphasize that it's not the only tool we have for great end-of-life care. And the reason I bring that up before I talk about the detail of where we are in Colorado is we've gotten a little bit into these words that imply to patients that it's the only way to have a dignified death. So, for instance, organizations like Death with Dignity, or people will talk about the Death with Dignity law. The public starts to translate that into medical aid in dying is the only way to have a dignified death. And I really want to bust that myth.
Sure.
For one, it's very destructive. Not everyone is qualified for medical aid in dying, nor does everybody want it
right
in their last days. And so we have to put it in good perspective. There are other ways to have a dignified, peaceful, patient-centered death. And so again, back to the toolbox. The toolbox represents that it's one choice for some people. So I was with a patient this week as he took his last breaths, and as we were sitting vigil, the family was talking about his life as a facilities manager in Denver for 30 years and how he could fix anything, this guy. There's quite the story as he was lying there. They were talking about plans for after death, which is not part of this conversation, but important. And they were talking about what they were going to choose for his ashes. And I was sitting there privately thinking, oh, it's obvious. It should be a toolbox. But I was not going to say that. That would be way out of my place to tell people what. So I said, well, what have you chosen then? And they started laughing. I mean, this is sitting vigil, and they started laughing, which is great. Humor is very important at end of life. And they pulled up the picture, and there was this picture of a special toolbox for his cremains. So it was a beautiful story, actually. That's how important it is.
Yeah.
It's amazing what we do learn, actually, sitting at the bedside at the end of life. So, in Colorado, we were kind of in the middle of the pack in getting our statute approved. Of course, we bow down at the feet of Washington and Oregon because they've had their statutes, their laws for decades now, and they have led the way in medical aid in dying, end-of-life care. And in Colorado, I was not involved with the advocacy, but there were a lot of folks who were trying to get this law through the legislature, and the legislature for several years refused to either engage or pass the law. And so finally, they got annoyed or tired or all of the above and decided to switch tactics. And this was actually passed in Colorado by a ballot initiative, which is a little different than other states. But it was ultimately passed with the largest margin of, I think, any ballot initiative. Close to 70% of Coloradans support the medical aid in dying legislation.
Yeah.
And that mirrors the statistics in other states, which I think is amazing.
Yeah.
You can measure it in different demographics, different political parties, different everything. And it almost always comes out that 65 to 70% of people support the ability for people to make use of aid in dying. Doesn't mean that 70% of people would use aid in dying, but they respect people's right to autonomy at the end of life, which is what it's really about.
Right.
So in 2016, our law was finally passed, and in 2017, it was implemented. Unlike other states, we didn't have an organization at that time. I think the people who did so much work thought, okay, we're done. Great, we have this law, and it'll be great. And I understand that, but not quite what happened. people who were prescribing and learned how to prescribe in those first few years were pretty private about it. There was some worries about would they be swamped with requests, what would happen. People didn't really want to be very public. And yet there were a lot of people in the state doing different aspects of the work. But it was pretty clear to us that that was pretty scattered, not a very focused effort. And so about 3 years ago, we convened a group of, actually the initial phone call I think had 50 people on it. Just people who were interested in end of life and medical aid and dying and might be interested in an organization. And from those early conversations, I helped to co-found End of Life Options Colorado. We're about 2.5 years old, so we're a baby as far as the other states go.
Yeah.
But our work is really focused on providing education and access for Coloradans. That's what it's about. And for me, as the clinician on the board, I'm now honored to be president of End of Life Options Colorado. When we talk about education, I get pretty focused on education of health professionals. This is not just education of the public, but education of health professionals so that they can be knowledgeable and help their patients and families if appropriate. In terms of the big picture in the United States, we're now one of 12 jurisdictions. Delaware's governor just signed last week. So we've added Delaware. New York's legislature just passed their bill after 10 years of work a couple of weeks ago. We're waiting.
Yeah.
Overall, what I'd say about medical aid and dying is we are working our way into the more mainstream of healthcare. For a long time, I think we were kind of outsiders. As I said, it was kind of private. And there's a lot of work going on to change that.
Yeah.
So that at a minimum, our healthcare providers and professionals in Colorado know what aid and dying is, that they know it's legal, that they know how to get their patients referred if they're not able to participate themselves.
Yeah.
And we've made quite a bit of progress in that regard, I would say, in Colorado, and we have a lot more work to do.
Yeah. So you mentioned this earlier. The other side of the chart is really about the patient and that side of the chart and centering on the patient. So talk a little bit more. You kind of did at the beginning, but maybe you could add to it. Like, what does that really look like in the final chapter of life? And are there opportunities where we should be doing that sooner? Which, again, I think you've touched on.
Yeah.
But again, maybe a big area of opportunity.
Sure. I do want to get to something that you had mentioned that I think is really important as we talk about the evolution of our laws, and that's language.
Okay.
Or myths or misconceptions.
For sure. Yeah.
So I was glad you had brought that up when we chatted originally, because this really has to be said, particularly what's going on in the press in certain places now. So just to be clear, medical aid and dying is not euthanasia. It's not assisted suicide. And it is not the only way to a dignified and peaceful death. I think I said that before.
You did, yeah.
And it is available and legal in Colorado. So we still have had clinicians tell patients that it doesn't matter what they want because it's illegal. So just to keep those myths busted for health care leaders, really important. I think the language is really critical for everybody to know what we're doing. Just to remember, to be frank and blunt, it's the terminal illness that kills these patients. It is not the medication. And that's really important. Okay, so speaking of patient-centered, sorry, I had to go there for a minute.
Thank you for touching on that.
I think about this a lot now, having been at the bedside in many different situations, or being partway on a journey with someone and then not being able to be there at the end. So, this question about what's truly patient-centered, if you'd asked me that a decade ago, I would have said, it's just what the patient wants. That should be simple. It's not so simple, because sometimes the patients don't know what they want. Sometimes we presume to know. Sometimes what the loved ones want and what the patient wants may be different.
Are not the same, yeah.
So, I had an ethics mentor who used to say when we'd ask questions, every answer was, it depends. And that's true in end-of-life care, right?
Yeah.
The only way to really do patient-centered approach in end-of-life care is, one, to put the patient at the center, which sounds obvious but doesn't happen most of the time these days, and to be able to take the time and the effort to really step back and listen and try to set aside what we think is important and what we would like, which affects all of us, but we kind of have to set that aside. And it's really what patients want. You know, when the law was being debated in 2016, I was working in a retirement community as the medical director, and I had a lot of really robust people, some of them in their 90s, by the way. And as the law was being passed, I mean, these were people who were healthy. They were coming into my office and they were saying, well, honey, you're going to help me with this if it comes to that, aren't you? You know, I think that a lot of us don't realize how much persons think about this in their 80s and 90s, and they want to talk about it. So the first thing about patient-centered care is, even before you have a terminal illness with a bad prognosis, is to be allowed to talk about your thoughts about your mortality.
Yeah.
And I hope geriatricians are doing that work,
right,
and other primary care folks, but I would argue that it's not being done enough.
Right.
When I would bring up these topics in the ambulatory setting, people would, you see this big sigh of relief, like finally someone will talk to me about what I'm worried about, what my death might look like, am I going to get a bad illness? So that's the first thing. And then once there is a terminal illness with a bad prognosis, I think, again, it's sticking with patients side by side, listening to what they want. And this is a really hard part, but it's making sure that the barriers to what they want, to achieving their goals, decreasing their anxiety, helping them figure it out, that we can get rid of some of the logistical barriers. Because if you think about it, and if you were in that situation and you had this overwhelming diagnosis and you were trying to talk to your adult children and your grandchildren, and you were trying to figure out what to do with your money and what to do with your fears and your personal spiritual crises, to have to worry about whether you're going to have a doctor to help you or a hospice nurse show up on time or repeat the story 25 times, you know, you wouldn't want to do that.
Right.
And that's the position we're putting our patients in every day because of a lack of integration of care.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I see a lot of the gaps. We just talked about palliative and hospice and direct end of life and aid in dying, and I probably made it sound like that was all a smooth transition. I wish.
Right.
You know, to be fair, there are some situations in which palliative care and hospice and specialty care are very well integrated and it goes very smoothly. Unfortunately, more often as I see these handoffs from one team to the next with not much communication going on. And then the patient is left having to repeat their story multiple times.
Right. And advocate. Yeah.
You know, some of the calls that are most heartbreaking for me that I get in my role as End of Life Colorado or as my consulting practice, calls from usually loved ones saying, there's nobody here to help us. Who's going to help us? My family member's suffering. Can't we do this? Why can't we do this? How are we going to do this? You know, it shouldn't be so hard for people. The information should be available. They should have access to it. And if you ask me, in an ideal world, they'd have a care team that would be following and helping.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a lot we could be working on.
Are there things that you've seen patients or families do or things teams have done that you wish were the norm? So you talked about some of the not so great things, but talk to us about some of the bright spots and what you've seen along the way.
Well, thanks. I think that we actually are seeing patient by patient some change in Colorado. So the patient I spoke about towards the beginning, I think there were some really bright spots. His family was with him all the way. His specialists, I think, gave him honest information about what they could and couldn't do. And when it came to the point where they realized that they had no more curative options, they didn't abandon him. They did help him get set up with hospice. Although, you know, at that point, they kind of backed off, which is pretty common. But they at least helped with that connection. And I don't know if they knew this at the time, but they happened to get him referred to a hospice that's been very active with medical aid in dying and more willing to talk with patients. And even though their medical director won't do the prescribing, that's a whole complicated area, but they were able to say, here, you need to call Barbara and, you know, she's going to help you. And the family was able to contact me. Because my practice is small and flexible, I was able to be in touch quickly. It's not just about me, it's just about systems.
Mm-hmm.
More importantly, when I said, well, what is your hospice saying about this? They said, they'll do whatever you need. And in fact, they did. They were sending me records, apologizing for any delays. And so the patient was more able to focus on what was going on with him. And his wife and adult daughter and the 2 little grandkids were able to spend that last 10 days really focused on what was going to be a very big loss. But they were able to do it in a way that was less bothered by all those logistics.
Sure.
And, the adult daughter in particular, I just remember she was so intent on helping her father achieve the kind of death he wanted, while at the same time being able to acknowledge how sad and upset she was.
Sure.
So that's a hard balance for these loved ones,
Yeah.
They want to respect their family member's wish, but they also rightfully are going to grieve.
Right.
So what I see in that is that they were communicating that part of the system actually worked very well for this person. And I think that's really key. I've had some families where the patient has very many siblings of different faith backgrounds or different interpretation. And, I had one patient recently who had 8 siblings.
Gosh.
I think 4 of whom were there on the day of taking medication. But they were all great. They had different views and a couple were on the phone. But the good part was they were saying, look, I wouldn't do this. I don't agree with it, or I do agree with it. But they weren't fighting about it. They weren't trying to put each other's values on the patient.
Yeah.
They were willing to accept his choice and then support each other afterwards. So, you know what? Just like most things in medical care, it's all about communication.
Yeah.
And then one of my very first situations, I got a call from, again, an adult. It's not always the daughters, but often an adult daughter saying, I know you can help me because I saw you somewhere or other on some media. And this is when having an advocate, whether it's your loved one or whoever it is so important. This patient had leukemia and she'd been in the hospital. She went to see her primary care person and said, I'm done, no more chemo. I know I'm done. This is what I want to do. The primary care physician told her that, well, 1, he didn't believe in it, and 2, it was illegal in Colorado. This was only 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
And instead of just like being intimidated or going away, the daughter, who was the advocate, was like, well, I know that's not right. And I'm going to figure this out on your behalf.
Wow. Yeah.
So not that I think loved ones or patients should always have to do that, but having a strong advocate is really important and is a bright light. And ultimately the patient was able to get what she wanted and what she deserved.
Yeah.
And then the other example, I think, again, just from recent experience, that's very hard but important, is when loved ones and patients can pivot and be flexible. Because as we all know, whatever we think might happen clinically doesn't always happen.
Sure.
And we haven't gone into the details of what it takes to qualify for aid in dying. If people are actively dying and no longer alert and capable, we can't use aid in dying, and we have to quickly pivot to what we think of as more traditional end-of-life medications and approaches.
Yep.
So I was recently with a family where when I first got to the home, they were just devastated. It was like, we should have done this yesterday. He wanted this. We should have done it. Wake up so you can do this medication. But once I was able to I was very glad to be there to take the anxiety down and say, wait, we've passed that window, but that doesn't mean this is going to go badly.
Right.
It can still go well, is the message I have.
Yeah.
And it did. But that's very important to understand that things change rapidly, right? In all of medicine, but particularly at end of life.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to not get stuck on one plan. I've done a lot of team leading of volunteers, both domestically and internationally. And, the top thing we say is we have to be flexible.
Yeah.
And it sounds strange, but in end-of-life care, really important.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's great advice. Let's talk, maybe as we kind of start to wrap things up a little bit, what the system needs. So you're doing this consulting work now, but you've also throughout your career worked in large systems and at the policy level. Are there things that need to change so more people can get access to this kind of end-of-life care that better aligns with their values?
Yeah, big question. So I think our statute, I had never before had to read statute and understand it until this. Because let's face it, most medicine is not, by law, right?
Sure.
And so it's kind of a strange position to be in. And I think that we need to do better at understanding the law and then having institutions implement with sound policies that are understandable. And the law is kind of understandable, but it leaves a lot open, which is good because I don't really want the law saying this is how much morphine you should give,
Right.
But we need a little more clarity, particularly in this area of patients accessing aid and dying. We have some big systems in Colorado and in other states as well who opt out completely. And in fact, some prevent their clinicians from participating at all. Obviously, my bias is that that's not really right, that patients have the right to this care. But even in situations where they're opting out, it's not clear what the opt-out means. And it's sometimes not clear what clinicians can and can't do. And that puts people in a really bad position.
Sure.
So we just need some clarity about that. I think our law is really actually quite good. There are some things we'd like to change as opposed to not requiring Colorado residency. And then the other place where we have a lot of work to do, and I would like to see a lot of change, is truly integrating hospice care with medical aid and dying. Our sister brother organizations in Washington and Oregon have really started some amazing work on this that we will be looking at more. And really having aid and dying be a normal part of hospice conversation, having hospice clinicians doing the prescribing, so that it's not considered this kind of separate, siloed thing from your usual hospice care. Now, I personally think that will be very important, and we need to get there eventually in Colorado, but I don't think it excludes other clinicians from doing this care.
Right.
It's just that we really want it to be as integrated as possible.
Sure.
And for the vast, vast majority of these patients, hospice care should be in place.
Yes.
Or will be in place. It makes sense to integrate that better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've maybe answered this, but if you haven't, if you could wave your magic wand and redesign the final mile of the healthcare journey, would that look like something that you haven't already told us about?
Well, maybe it would look like the pieces I've talked about all pulled together, right? Because we've talked about some gaps and some really beautiful things. So for me, what it looks like is when I'm there sitting vigil at the end. This is a patient surrounded by their loved ones in a place they want to be, at a time they want to be, with their professional care team, whoever that might be, kind of directing what I think of as the symphony of their last days.
Yeah.
That's what I like to see when it happens. It's quite amazing. But, to be trite, it takes a village to do that. In this example, it takes an orchestra, right?
Yeah.
It really has to be synchronized. It has to be consistent. It has to be compassionate.
Yeah.
I have strong belief that we can do that despite the challenges we have. But we can't do it without people having clear vision, being willing to engage in curiosity about what options we have and how we can do that. And then really working together for change.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. That is actually just a wonderful way to kind of wrap up our main conversation. As you might know from listening to some of my earlier podcasts, that I do try to kind of wrap up and end on a kind of what I call a non-clinical vitals check. And so ask you kind of one rapid fire question so that the audience can learn more about you personally. Is there something about your chart, if we were to read your chart, is there something that your chart would never capture that you want to share with our audience listening today?
Oh, yeah. My chart would never capture my love of travel and volunteering and engaging teams in becoming not only highly functional, but highly engaged in whatever community or environment we're working. And as you can guess, that applies directly to my care at home.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. This has just been fantastic. I am so grateful for the time that you've given myself and the audience and your advocacy for for patient rights, and really, I think, sharing kind of what I would call a master class in patient-centered care and in particular end-of-life care. And that's really special. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks for having me. It was an honor.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. And what a gift to hear your wisdom and stories from the bedside. Dr. Morris reminds us that end-of-life care isn't about a single option or law, but about creating what she calls a symphony of support that listens to patients, relieves suffering, and truly reflects what matters most to them. Her message is clear. We have tools, but it takes systems, teams, and compassion to use them well. If you'd like to learn more about her work, you can visit End of Life Options Colorado. Thank you for joining us on the other side of the chart. I hope this conversation encourages you to think differently about how we design care, especially in the moments that matter most. And be sure to tune in next time when we'll be joined by Dr. Victor Montori to talk about what it means to move beyond industrialized medicine and reclaim careful and kind care. The Other Side of the Chart is a production of G-Berg Productions, produced and hosted by Dr. Jill Goldenberg. Sound editing by Anthony Rotolo. Music by Relaxing Motivational Corporate by Fretbound. From Free Music Archive, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 4.0.